welcome to our final summer program. I'm sure, well, first I'll introduce myself. My name is Toby Crawford. I am Vice President of the Sullivan Sorrento Historical Society, and I am so happy to be a part of this with you tonight. I'm sure that...
Closer to the light.
I'm sure that most of you have memories of the Viberts as friends, collaborators, customers, collectors, and I think you'll all be delighted with this program this evening, put together by Suzanne Mace and Hollis Hills. This is the story of Denis and Ruth. Both of their stories, how they came together, a little family background, and it's really something that we as Sullivanites or Hancock County Downies and Mainers, we should be proud of. So I'm glad that you are all here to share this with us this evening. And I'll introduce first Suzanne Hills Mace, who is the niece of Denis and Ruth Vibert.
Good evening. It's great to see such a tremendous crowd. I was told there might be 20, maybe 30 people. So this is thrilling. And my aunt and uncle are very special to us. And Ruth and my mother, Betty, were like twins. Betty would be very pleased to see this turnout for her sister. Also from the Historical Society, because she was one of the founders of the Sullivan Sorrento Historical Society. So this is for you, Mom. We're going to start with this form, which is a contract of indenture to a James Benjamin Meynell in 200 years ago in 1826 in London. And he's the one that started the Meynells that ended up coming to Maine. Ruth, in case you didn't know, his maiden name was Meynell. So James Benjamin served 7 years with a tailor named Richard Hinton in London. He completed his indenture contract and was working as a tailor in London when he met and married Louisa Gillespie. The young couple had decided that after talking with Louisa's brother, who had immigrated to Boston, that it would be, and he encouraged them to come over to leave the smoggy, dirty, coal-fired, narrow streets of London and come to the New World. And so they took a ship and landed in New York, where James opened up his tailor shop. He was successful and had 2 children. He and Louisa had a little boy and a little girl while they were in New York. And that's when disaster hit and the tailor shop burned to the ground. They lost everything. So here they were in the New World with nothing. They moved up to Boston, where Louisa's brother lived, and eventually got back on their feet, started over again. And that's when the second disaster hit. And they were robbed one night. The entire shop was wiped out, everything gone, their machines and fabric. So the young couple at this point were probably wondering why they'd ever left London. But James had made a friend of a Captain Preble who lived in Sullivan, Maine. And he sailed between Sullivan and Boston and encouraged them to come to beautiful Sullivan, where there was a busy shipbuilding industry, there was fishing, there was the granite industry, so the town was growing, and he felt that they would do very well there. So they moved once again, and they moved to a little house sitting on the hill overlooking Sullivan Harbor. I'm not sure that this was the actual house, but this is the hill overlooking Sullivan Harbor. And you can see the harbor to the left. and the mill pond to the right, and the road that goes up to Franklin. And in the middle, the road that goes back to West Sullivan and North Sullivan. They lived there for a short period of time, and he was doing so well that they bought their own house. And so they bought the house just down the street in Sullivan Harbor, beside York Hill Cemetery. And probably many of you, maybe all of you, have driven by this house and seen it. And it was a lovely new house at that point, had big barns, and had lots of room for the 6 additional children that they had when they came to Sullivan. The 6th child and second son was named James Franklin Maynell, and this is James. He grew up in Sullivan and was living with his parents in the homestead, and then his father passed away, so he stayed with his mother, Louisa, and he married Ella Bridgham. And Ella Bridgham was the daughter of Dr. Roland Bridgham. For anybody that's familiar with Sullivan history, he was the first doctor that came to Sullivan in 1820 and lived in East Sullivan and had a clinic there. So James and Ella were in their 30s when they married, and Ella was actually 5 years older than James. They only had one child, and that is this little guy whose name was Harold Bridgham Maynell, and they always called him Hal, and he was my grandfather. So when he was 12 years old, Ella died. So little Hal was raised by his dad, James Franklin, here in the middle, and his grandmother at the homestead. And when he was 20, his father remarried a woman who came down from New Brunswick named Alma, and had 3 more children. So Hal had 3 step-siblings, but by that time he had pretty much finished school. He went to school at Hebron Academy. In those days they sent kids away to high school sometimes. And Dr. Roland had moved to Sullivan from Hebron, so I suspect they had a family there. Well, Hal graduated from high school, and he headed down to Boston, where he took a business course, and then was selling pianos in a music store and doing bookkeeping in Cambridge, Mass. One day he heard some beautiful music coming from the showroom and wandered in, and this lovely young lady was sitting there, my grandmother, Jessie Holder. Jessie had come down from St. John, New Brunswick, where she grew up. Her father was a sea captain, Captain Robert Holder, and she decided to follow her sisters who had come to Boston from St. John to go to nursing school and were working at Mass General Hospital, much to their father's displeasure. He did not feel that nursing was a proper vocation for a young lady in the early 1900s, but because it was the early 1900s, they went anyway, and were working in Boston when Jessie decided to come down. However, Jessie had no interest at all in taking care of sick people or working in a hospital, but she came down to sing. She was an opera singer, and she was came to Boston to take music lessons and opera lessons. And she and Hal apparently liked each other and were married within the next year. And this was their first home, Mrs. Sheridan's boarding house. And they lived there in Cambridge for a year until Jessie's parents asked them to come back to Canada because Jessie's younger brother, Surrey, had gone west, young man, to Vancouver and was living in a small lumber town called Poquathan. And they had some serious concerns about what was happening out west there. So they asked the young couple to take a trip out and to check in with Surrey. Surrey and Jessie were the last 2 of 7 children who were very close. And of course, being a young couple, free of encumbrance, they gladly jumped on a train. You see them here with a group of people in front of the locomotive. I'm not sure where the rest of the train was, but and they headed to, landed in Poquathan. We have a picture at the bottom of the little town, and it was a little town. There was a millionaire Canadian who bought up thousands of acres of land in the north of Canada and had a lumber mill and was producing lumber, which was being sent all over the world through Vancouver. Well, they found Surrey, and he was at the store that he had started and was very successful, and he seemed to be fine. So they liked the area, and they decided to stay. So there's Jessie sitting on the steps, and her brother Surrey behind her in front of the store. Within the next year, Jessie gave birth to their first child, and she was called Ella Elizabeth Maynell, after their two mothers. And they all, ever after, was known as Betty. So we see Betty Maynell come into the picture, and she and her mother are sitting on the porch of the house that they lived in. After a year, they decided to follow Surrey back to the east and went to Stockton and Sullivan on the way back and visited Grandpa Maynell. And little Betty got to meet her uncle, Lou, who was 1 year older than her, because Hal, James's second family, was quite a bit difference in age. They went to Moncton, and that's where little Ruth, Donald Maynell, was born. And the two girls were fast friends right from the get-go, and for the rest of their lives were like twins. They moved one more time because Hal was working in a biscuit company that Surrey had started. Surrey was quite the entrepreneur in Moncton, and Surrey wanted to expand, so he expanded down into Quebec and sent Hal to work in that cookie company in Montreal. And so the family is now settled in Montreal, where they stay and where Ruth and Betty may now grow up. They had a good growing up. They enjoyed living in the city. They ice skated, skied, and summers they visited Sullivan to visit their grandfather. And the top picture is little Ruth fishing on Flanders Pond. And the picture beside is Betty and Ruth, a little bit older, with Grandpa Maynell's pal, Bossy. And then Ruth is riding a horse, his horse in the other picture. Ruth loved to ride. Ruth was very athletic. Where my mother was a little more dreamy and like literature and sort of quiet things, Ruth wanted to be going all the time. Those of you that know her probably recognize that trait formed early on. Girls started dancing in high school and were taking lessons at Evan's sister's School of Dance for a number of years, and pretty soon they succeeded and were putting on shows and performing all over Montreal. And eventually they were asked to stay and teach, which they did for another year or so, and then they decided to open up their own school. So we have here their business card, Maynell Dance Studio, which says it's for young and old can now learn the up-to-minute steps with confidence and style. So they were teaching more than just taps and ballet, although they did teach those classes. You can see Ruth was the tap dancer. Mom was the ballet dancer, although she seems to be doing the Spanish dance in this picture. Everything was great until 1939 came around, and Germany invaded Poland, and France and England declared war on Germany, and Canada, being part of the British Commonwealth, was in the war too, and they mobilized. And so soon all the young husbands and cousins and boyfriends were shipping out either to the Army or the the Air Force. And so Betty went to say goodbye to a boyfriend who was shipping out from Charlottetown to England. He joined the RCAF. And on the train over, she met a lovely young woman named Frida Tull. And they talked and chatted all the way and decided to meet for coffee that next Monday morning before Betty headed back to Montreal. And so Frida showed up for coffee, and along with her, she brought her father, Papa Tull. Now, Papa Tull had emigrated to Prince Edward Island in the 1920s from Syria, and they had a big Syrian family, and he was a successful businessman. There's some talk that there might have been a little bootlegging going on, but in any case, Papa Tull was very successful, and he's leaning in front of his building that he owned, and Mom made the comment during this breakfast that she just loved Prince Edward Island, loved the coast, loved the water, being so close to the water, and Charlottetown was a lovely town. Wasn't as big a city as Montreal, but it had a lot of the amenities that they were used to. And she said, you know, I could just live here. Well, Papa Tal challenged her on that and said, well, why don't you move here? And she said, well, I didn't know what I would do. And he said, well, what are you doing in Montreal? She said, teaching dance. And he said, well, we haven't had a dance teacher here on the island for years. So, and I just happen to have space in my building. The V Club was on top, which was a sort of like a USO, a dinner dance club for the servicemen and their dates. And on the bottom was a dentist's office and a lawyer's office. And we can see that within a short period of time, the white sign hanging under the V Club says Maynell Dance School. So Mom agreed to come back and manage the V Club in the evenings if she could have the space on the second floor for her dance school, which is what happened. She opened the school, and within 4 months was so busy because the economy was good in Charlottetown. There were two major military bases there. The RCAF had a base in Charlottetown, and the RAF had a base in Summerside, a town farther up the island. So there were lots of people, support people around, and they all wanted to take dancing lessons apparently, because she was teaching ballroom to adults as well as the children. And so within 4 months, Ruth closed the shop, the studio in Montreal, and came to Prince Edward Island and worked with Mom, which was a big support for Mom because she was doing double duty at the V Club. And we see in this middle picture Ruth and Betty and Frida Tull and her sister Selma Tull. And they became great friends and were a great help to Mom and to Aunt Ruth getting settled into the island, as was Papa Tull. He sort of adopted them. And then this menu card is from the V Club on January 1941. So see Mom threw a New Year's Eve party, a New Year's party for the club. Around this time, a young RCAF pilot in training came onto the scene, and his name was Ken Hills, and he was my father. Dad grew up in Southern California, in South Pasadena, with a single mom and a brother 2 years younger than himself. And he was a great athlete. He played baseball, played basketball, went to college on a basketball scholarship. And before the war started, he was racing motorcycles for Harley Davidson. So you could see he loved the speed. And so when the war broke out, he had an opportunity to go to Canada and join the Air Force because the Americans weren't in it yet. So he packed his bag and went up to Alberta, where he took flight lessons and training, and eventually was sent to Charlottetown, Prince Edward Island, where he eventually walked up the stairs of the V Club and caught sight of the manager and was quite attracted, liked what he saw. However, Betty had a very strict rule that there would be no fraternizing with the customers, and that they were not, she and Ruth would not date any of the men that they were teaching dance to or that they were meeting at the club. They were friendly, but these guys were shipping out and they didn't need complications, so there was to be no dating. Well, Dad wasn't happy with that rule, and he bribed one of the waitresses for Mother's telephone number, and called her up and sweet-talked her into going just for a picnic and bike ride, which they did the next day, and the bike ride lasted all day until that night they went out for dinner at the King George Hotel, and 3 weeks later they were married. Things happened fast in the war. Dad was supposed to be shipping out, which was one of the reasons why they married so quickly. However, at the last minute, he got the news that they were signing him to the RAF base in Summerside as a pilot instructor. So they had 4 months together. They rented a tiny little apartment, and they lived in Summerside for those 4 months. And then eventually Dad was sent over to Middlewall, England. This bottom picture shows him, he's in the navy blue outfit, For some reason, found the flight suits were too bulky, so oftentimes he would just wear some kind of a jumpsuit. And he's with a squadron of American volunteers, they call the Eagle Squadron, flying with the RAF. So he did that for about 9 months, and then he realized by that time the Americans were in the war, and the Americans were getting paid twice as much as the poor British pilots, because Britain had no money. They were bankrupt after 3 years of war, and America was still pretty flush. They had a pretty good wartime economy. So Dad, feeling responsible as a new husband, that he needed to be saving money for their future, packed his bag and walked across the airport to the other side where the Americans were. And he joined what was then the Army Air Corps. Well, it wasn't the Air Force yet, but Army Air Corps. One of the other happy things that happened was he got to fly the new P-51 Mustangs that were just coming online. And you see him here standing on his plane. You probably can't read it, but the name was written on it, the beautiful Betty. Now we're going to switch to another young man who found his way to Charlottetown, Prince Edward Island. His name was Denis Vibert. Denis grew up on the island of Jersey, one of the Channel Islands off the coast of, well, it's actually off the coast of France, but it is part of the Great Britain, British Empire. His dad owned a grocery store, and you see him standing in front of it. That's Tom, and his mother's name was Flo. And they raised 3 sons, and Denis was the youngest. And we see Denis with his dad. Looks like they might be at some sort of a county fair, and he's holding the cup. So I can only assume he won the most beautiful baby or something. He seems to be quite pleased with it. And then on the other side is their home, Spring Grove, which they moved into at some point after moving out of the upstairs of the grocery store. Denis grew up on the sea, grew up on an island, and he and his brother Bob are pictured here with their boat called the Tiny, and it is tiny. They were on the water whenever they could, living so close they could be sailing and rowing and swimming. And Denis loved the outdoors right from the time he was very young. He'd rather be outside than in a classroom, as opposed to his brothers, who both were quite studious and grew up to become 2 lawyers. Denis's family finally sent him off to the RMS Worcester Nautical Training College, which was part of London College, to be sort of like a Maine Maritime Academy, where he did very well and graduated with honors. And then the war broke out. These are taken from 2 panels that hang in the Jersey Occupation Museum, and they kind of depict what happened on Jersey. The Germans arrived, and before that, people had to make a decision because they knew they were coming closer and closer through France, that the Channel Islands would be next to be occupied. And so families had to decide to stay or leave, send their kids to London. It was pretty horrific. The Vibert family decided that they would all leave. They had a relative who had a home in this little town called Aldermaston. It looks like something from All Creatures Great and Small, and that was their little English town. So they moved into the schoolhouse that Aunt Lil owned, the whole family. The boys were all headed for the military. But the Germans didn't come, so everything was quiet on Jersey. The ferries were running back and forth for over a week, and so Denis made the fateful decision that he would just take the ferry and go back just overnight so that he could properly close up his farm, which he'd left in a hurry, and also do some banking. So he took the ferry over and did his business and went to sleep. And the next morning, instead of the ferry arriving, the Germans arrived. They bombed the island. Multiple people were killed, and there was no ferry off. So Denis was trapped on the island. And Denis did not like being trapped and did not like being told what to do. So he spent the next 1.5 years plotting his escape from the island. And I'm going to read this part because it's in his own words. It's very brief. But if anybody's interested in the entire story of the escape, the Historical Society has a copy of his interrogation notes from MI5 and Naval Intelligence. Escape number 1, November 1940 in Tiny. his childhood boat. That was the little white boat that we saw he involved in. That was his first escape. Rowed 23 miles to Rochester Reef. Northern wind blew for 4 days, out of food and water, to make the 100 miles to English Southern Channel. Returned by night unseen. And that was probably the second miracle, was that he got back onto the island because there were armaments, all around the coast. Early 1941, Germans demand all boats brought to the harbor. Den rents shed near shore, buys ragamuffin for $5, raises the sides with boards and steam. You can see how, here's a picture of ragamuffin, you can see where the additional boards were put on. Siphoned petrol from a German lorry, German truck, transported the boat under tomato boxes to shed. Tuesday, September 21st, 1941, at 9 p.m., 2 friends helped get boat to the shore and push off. 2 German E-boats passed within 100 yards, but fortunately didn't see him, but swamped the boat and ruined all his food. Choppy seas allowed seawater in the engine tank, and the first engine quit. He threw that overboard and was trying to attach the second engine, but had trouble because where he built the sides up, the wood was thicker and the engine wouldn't fit on, and it fell overboard. Drifted and sailed 2 days out of water when he arrived off Portland Bill, on the coast of England, in the evening. Picked up by a destroyer, HMS Rockelsgate, had to be lifted out and patched up. He was so stiff from all those days in the boat, seawater, rowing, that he couldn't even stand up. But he said they patched him up, gave him a clean bed and food, and it was just like heaven. After escorting the ship to the Irish Sea, they returned to Dartmouth 3 days later and unloaded Den, whereupon he was immediately taken in by Naval Intelligence and MI5 because they had to be sure he wasn't a German infiltrator, because the Germans were trying to get people on the island all the time. So we have this picture of Ragamuffin. Then reunited with his family briefly, and then, the other part of the interrogation was, as they were interrogating him to find out if he was this German, all of a sudden a guy standing out in the hall yelled, "Dan, what are you doing here?" It was one of his schoolmates. So the fears of the interrogators were allayed, and they then started questioning him about what was happening on Jersey and where the armaments were, and how many Germans were there. So he was able to give them some very valuable information. So he reunited with his family and then immediately joined the RAF. And of course, he was sent to Charlottetown to train. It was wintertime, and again, you can't train pilots over the skies, flat-filled skies of England, so all the pilots had to be sent over to Canada. And there were bases all around Canada, but the big one was on Prince Edward Island, and that was in the Summerside. So Den was in Summerside through the page. You can see him in the snow in front of his training plane, and he learned to fly and did very well, and eventually found his way up to the second floor of the V Club, where Ruth Vibert was giving a lesson, and when he swung the door open, he thought he was at the V Club because he heard music coming out. She asked him curtly what he wanted, and he said, well, he was looking for the V Club. Well, that's upstairs. He said, well, what are you doing? And she said she was giving dance lessons. And he said, well, I think I would like to learn to dance. So the next thing we know, 1 week later, Mom is looking at the studio schedule and saying, who's this Sergeant Vibert you've got down for a private lesson at the end of the day? And so the cat was out of the bag, and within 2 months, they were married. They went to Uncle Surrey's in Moncton, and you see Uncle Surrey in the gray outfit, and they were married and had a brief honeymoon down on the St. John River in Holderville, where the Jesse's family had summer cottages. And then he was sent off right away. By the time they met, he was shortly to go overseas. And he flew Wellington intelligence gathering planes when he went back to England. So Ruth, because she was now the wife of an Englishman, qualified for going over to England. And so the government would arrange for her to go over. But she had to wait 3 or 4 months, and she had no idea. All she knew was that she couldn't be allowed to go over. And suddenly she got a telegram with the name of a hotel in Yonkers, New York. And that's all. So she got on the train, and she checked into the hotel in Yonkers. And at that point, she went to bed not knowing what was going to happen next. And they woke her up in the morning and said, "There's a taxi for you here." So she took the taxi out to the wharf and loaded on to the ship. It was a Swedish merchant ship. It was part of a big flotilla heading across the ocean, and sailed away to England. She made out fine. Her ship was perfectly safe, but 2 of the ships in the convoy were torpedoed and sunk. So it was pretty harrowing for her. However, she landed in England. Denis met her at the train station. He was on leave, and took her to the schoolhouse in Aldermaston. And we see she also met his older brother Ralph and his father and Ralph's little girl Susan. And they were all staying, well, not Ralph, but the rest of them were staying at the schoolhouse. So it was kind of a crowded house by the time Ruth joined, but everybody greeted her warmly and made her feel welcome. The time there was difficult for Ruth because a year later she had a little baby boy that they named Thomas, but he had some congenital heart issues and didn't live more than a few days. So it was difficult for both of them. But I have a letter that Ruth wrote my grandmother saying that she couldn't feel sorry for herself because she was surrounded with loss and death and sorrow. And the doctor had told her that they would be able to have more children. No reason to think they couldn't. And so she pulled up her bootstraps and carried on. We see her sitting in the backyard of Aldermaston on a bench that Den made, and the ragamuffin is upside down behind her head on the grass. And up in the back, those boxes and cages are rabbit cages, because wartime they raised rabbits, and that's what they ate for protein, for meat. This was wartime in England, and things were pretty tough. Fortunately, Ruth liked rabbits, so they ended up going to, the war ended, and we have a great picture in the back of Aldermaston on VE Day, when the war was officially, in Europe was officially over. And all the villages and the churches had, at noontime, rang their bells, and they had church services, and the whole town of Aldermaston turned out. And in this picture, they were all in this picture, in this photograph, with Uncle Den and Aunt Ruth and Tom and Flo Vibert and Susan's mother, Muriel, Ralph's wife, were there. The next thing was that with the war ended, somebody had to go back to Jersey and see what on earth was left of their home. And so they decided that Ruth and Denis should do that. And so Ruth and Den went to Jersey. They found a home in perfect shape. The people that had taken care of it while they were gone had done an excellent job. And so eventually, there were German POWs now all over the island, and they had them cleaning up the bombs that they'd left. So Ruth said that was quite a traumatic sight to see when they were there. Eventually, the rest of the family came over, and Denis made the decision that he couldn't stay in Jersey. There were just too many bad memories and too many horrors. And so he let Ruth know that he didn't want to stay. But he surprised her by saying, "I think we should go to Canada and live with your parents." So that is what they did. They took the Queen Elizabeth out of Southampton and sailed to New York City, and then took a train. And I have the menu card of the dinner of the last night on the Queen Elizabeth. And they met up in New York, in Montreal, at Grams's house. And my mom and dad came back from California, where Dad was teaching flying at one of the bases. And beside them is Mom's best friend, Vi McMillan, and beside her is Ruth's best friend, Marty Trower. And then there's Ruth and Den with his hand in front of his face, and another couple that were friends, I don't know their names. And so they had this great, wonderful picture taken. Actually, Marty gave me this picture. Marty's here tonight, too. Gordon and Mark's daughter. And we just get the biggest kick out of it because every time we look at it, we think of the Sesame Street little game. One of these things is not like the other. And that would be my mom and dad who just arrived from California, rather than the hard times in Britain and Canada that the Canadians are still feeling. So I'm going to leave the story at this point, and my brother's going to pick up with the Viberts coming to Sullivan.
It's a hard act to follow. I'm Hollis Hills, Betty's son and nephew of Ruth and Uncle Denis. So I'm going to pick up, if I can make this work, where it left off. Mother had married an Air Force pilot. Actually, at the time, he was an RAF pilot. And he careered in the Air Force. We had a great life doing it. Travel all over the world. I'm sorry. Travel all over the world. And, but unfortunately, there were 2 other times where my father was stationed somewhere where they didn't allow dependents. So my mother, getting ready to give birth to child number 1, went to Montreal and lived with her parents and gave birth to my older brother, Kenneth, who we always called Bruce, so we wouldn't confuse the 2 names of my father, Kenneth and him. And there's a photo here is a picture of Kenneth with Hal and Al, his grandfather, and that's me, with the one. And the same thing happened to me. My father got shipped off somewhere. I believe it was probably where the Greek Revolution was going on, and he could not have dependents there, so I was pregnant. They came to Montreal, and both my brother and I are Canadians. We're also American citizens too. My father was an American citizen. Ruth and Denis shows them arriving at probably this is the New York area, and they came to Montreal. And after some talk, Aunt Ruth went to work at the Evans Sisters School, dancing school, and also the Arthur Murray School. Denis didn't really know what to do, so he ended up going to the Montreal Provincial Polytechnic Art School and studied ceramics because during the war he was doing some ceramics when he was at a period of time where he was not fit to be flying. And so that led to his career. And when he graduated, they had to make a piece to graduate, and the doll in the middle of this is a huge pottery doll that he made that for his graduation to show that he could do it. And it was great. The vase on the left and the squat person on the left, also of the doll, we ended up getting. And so it's just brings us memories of Ruth and Den constantly. They had gone from Montreal to New Brunswick, where Ruth's mother's family was from, to see what they maybe could find to buy and start a business, a pottery shop. Nothing was there. So they came back to Maine, to Sullivan, where Uncle Lou had Bay Head Inn in Sullivan Harbor, and they stayed with him, and he said, "Look, there's a place for sale just down the road." And they went down, and there's the pottery shop, what it turned out to be, and they bought it right on the spot. It didn't have any running water or fresh toilets, But it did have electricity, so it was like, and I remember Ruth telling me about having a bath and a big tub in the kitchen. So that is the beginning of the Viberts in Sullivan. Denis found a clay bank across the road, and he got permission from the owner to dig the clay, and so he was getting ready to start. He dug the clay and then mixed it with another type of fire clay, and that started to become the developing the red clay stoneware. Ruth worked very diligently with him to make sure that everything was going well. And this, in the picture on the bottom right, is she's actually weighing pieces of clay that Denis is going to throw, because they did it by weight to make certain things. And here's poor Uncle Denis pounding away, mixing clay with what looks like a piece off a tree and a big wooden barrel. But he wouldn't have it any other way. Uncle Denis would never have been able to work for anyone in this world. So, and that's one of the reasons he went to ship school, because he wouldn't work with anyone in this world. So here's a picture of Uncle Denis throwing pottery early on. Ruth is tending the kiln, and from where I see, because of the light, it looks like it might be on. And I never heard that. So they get pottery made, and Uncle Denis's talent showed up immediately. And on that table, was showing the various pieces of pottery, are some of the first pieces they ever made, because that was the shop. It was a shop, a table in their house. And they went from there and expanded, of course. The other room is the room for glazing. That's right. Glazing room, where they glaze the pottery. Ruth decided that she wanted to do something, and so she started a dance school in her house. And many of the young people in Sullivan, mostly girls, came through, and they did dances, and she taught them the leaders. And they had recitals. They had recitals at the North Sullivan Church, they had them at the Grange Hall, and they also had them at the Hancock School. And to this day, I run into people who said, "Oh, I took dance at your aunt's place." She made a name, and she was a great instructor. Denis is still working on glazes, starting to settle down to make a few. And here is a group of pots that they had that they, in this case, they went around to various art places to have shows. Also, anywhere that they could get a show to spread the name. Ruth, sitting here in the shop, was getting ready to expand because her father, Al, had sent her $300, and Al was a businessman, and he said, "You need something there more than pottery." And so she got into, with some local craftsmen and some foreign craftsmen, to sell various things in the pottery shop. But some of you probably have some vases maybe, or similar things to these pictures, and things that have that particular glaze. Ruth unfortunately lost her second child. His name was Stephen. He lived for about 3 hours. He died of the same exact thing that the previous child, Tom, died of in London. And Ruth was devastated. It was a terrible, terrible time in her life. Her father and mother decided they would move down to Sullivan and find a house where they could spend summers and also maybe retire to. And so they came down and also to help and work with Ruth. They came down and bought this little house right next door to the pottery shop. You can see it in the background. It was a nice little house, but needed a lot of work. In the photo on the bottom right, Hal, my grandfather, is building a sun porch on the back of the house. He went on to also build a screen-in porch on the front of the house, and the house became what we recognize when we come in the summer as the house in the bottom of the left. Hal liked to bird hunt, and so here's a photo of him bird hunting. I didn't realize that, that he smoked, and he's obviously got a cigarette in his mouth. Jessie, my grandmother, for whatever reason, I'm not sure, because she didn't swim and things like that, is here at the North Sullivan Granite Board, where people went swimming. I went swimming there at the same place when I was in high school. I don't know what it's called now, but we called it the Toad Hole.
Still is.
We were now living in Washington, D.C., so my mother was able to, for the summers, to get a train from D.C. into Ellsworth, and here we are in Ellsworth. There's myself on the left, my older brother Ken, Denis, and Sen, and Suzanne, who was just up here, is on the right. This started our summer date times in Sullivan. Denis's mother, Flo, came over almost every summer, and this is Flo in front of the shop when it now has the pottery sign started on it. She was a lovely lady and helped Ruth out a lot. Denis wanted to have something to do at the shore other than have to drive the car down with water and stuff and then drive it back. So he went over and found in Sorrento an ice house. And I don't know how he got it down there, but it ended up on the shore behind their house. And it became the famous shack on the shore. That's what we call it. And it was a meeting place for the Manels, Hills, and Viberts. They converted it so it had a loft. We spent the night there. It was just a great place. And on the right is a picture of my younger brother, Donald, who, like myself and my brother, was born in a foreign country. He was born in Scotland, for a station. The only person that was actually born in the United States was my sister, Suzanne. In 1960, just before Christmas, I believe it was the 12th, and actually it was looking at the aggregate newsstand date, they had a terrible fire at the flower shop in the area of the barn. It destroyed all of the items that they had built up to ship out for Christmas. So it was devastating, just terrible. But it turns out that it's one something, a good thing in disguise, but it took a while to find that. Denis and company rebuilt the shop, but before that, the citizens of Sullivan came and helped put out the fire, and some of them stood in the brook in December that flows down by the place, pushing up rocks to make a dam so there was water for the fire trucks. And they spent hours in that water. Great people. The shop now becomes more like it is today. It's not today, but what's final outcome was it allowed them to change the entrance to the shop. They now put a set of stairs when you slid the door from the barn to the left and went up the stairs directly into the sales room. Also, Uncle Denis was able to, if he wanted to, put a rope with a hook on it and block out the potting where they were potting and keep it to himself. Sometimes he loved the people, other times he didn't. And I remember one time somebody said, "Oh, Mr. Vibert, this is so great. You must find this so exciting." He said, "I did on the first 100. At this time, their business really started to take off. So we needed to bring another partner in. We said, Ronnie Frank Stokes, great and nice person, very, very good potter. And there's a picture of Frank on the right-hand photo. And these are basically already glazed pieces waiting to go into the kiln. Uncle Denis is here incising one of his beautiful lamps, my favorite thing that he ever made, and getting ready for it to be fired. And he made all his designs in that way. The shop now becomes the shop like everybody probably recognizes. And it's wonderful. There you have it. Artwork, I can identify some of the artwork, that there are some pieces up on the very top right of Dan Miller's, these are in the audience with us. Also, it looks like the two pieces, especially the one on the left wall, on the back wall on the left, looks like it's a Vibert. Not 100% sure that that's what it looks like. They have a wide selection of artwork, pottery, various things like that. And on the picture on the left are lamps and the shades. And the shades that they had made were just beautiful. A lady by the name of Anna Kozlow from Rockport made them for years for them. And I can remember a couple times in the summer driving over to her place to pick up lampshades to bring them to their shop. She got done doing it and actually moved to New Hampshire, I believe. So Frank's wife, Dottie Stokes, started making lampshades. And she made them for quite a few years. And then she got done, and somehow it fell upon my wife, Ellie, to be the lampshade maker. And for the next, basically 3 years, she made all the lampshades for the barber shop. I didn't realize what a process it was to do it. You had to go out and pick plants, flowers, weeds, whatever, ferns, things like that, and then put them in a press in between newspaper, and then tighten it up, and it took forever for them to dry. So it was, what you were doing there was probably going to be used a few months in the future. Also, every one of those lamps were hand punched where they ran the ribbon through. There was no thing. I would sit there and punch and punch and punch and punch and punch. And then the 2 layers of putting the various things in. But the lamp shade still stayed beautiful. I can't tell who made what other than by age, sometimes looking how old they are. Ellie can pretty much identify which one she made, and I think which one's Dottie made. And so that's how Ellie became an employee of Vibert's. Denis and Ruth would head back to Jersey anytime they were able to. Here's a family picture of Denis, his brother Ralph, his brother Bob, their wives, Tom and Flo Vibert in front. And the young ladies are all most of them are the Vibert nieces, 7 Vibert nieces, who came over to the States many, many times to be in the summer when they were young, when they were teenagers, when they were beyond teenagers, when they were adults with their families. They loved coming here. And this is a photo I find very interesting because Ruth is sitting, second person on the left. She looks like my mother. It's the first time I've seen a picture of Ruth that looks like my mother. One Christmas we decided to come to Maine for a white Christmas. We were stationed, my father was stationed in New Jersey at McGuire Air Force Base, and there wasn't much snow there, so we said we'd come. We had a brown Christmas in Maine. There wasn't big snow on the ground. I mean, forget it. There was more snow in Beverly, New Jersey than there was in Maine. But we had a great time. It was hard not to have a good time with Ruth and Dan. And there's a picture of my brother, myself, my sister, and my younger brother-in-law in front of the Christmas tree, and a picture of my parents in front of opening their presents, and Uncle Dan making one of his usual poses when he knew somebody was taking a photograph of him. There will be another one later. But we had a wonderful Christmas. They made great contacts with the local art people. Many of them became great friends. The top picture on the left is a artist, Tessa Gilbert, who had one of the works that came back, and her husband, Phil Horton, and he was intelligentsia type person, literary, etc. And this looks like it's their house that they stayed in the summer down in Columbia. Another wonderful friend of theirs was Miriam Caldwell, who was in the couch between my mother and Denis. To us, she wasn't there. She was Mimi. That's what we like to call her, Mimi Caldwell. And she was one of the first people to come to the shop. She and her partner, Shannon Hall, who was the individual that sculpted the violin or viola for the Montague School of Conducting that's in the park. Of course, Dan Miller was just, you can't talk enough about Dan, what a great friend he was, what a wonderful person he is, and how calm and nice. It was always a pleasure to see him and talk to him. On the bottom right is Stella, the other half of Stella and Chevis. Stella and Chevis had a studio in Camden where they did silk screens and other things. Chevis was actually name was William Chevis, but we never called him anything but Chevis. And she was always Stella. Was one of the founders of the Haystack Mountain School. He was a very interesting guy, Scotsman, and was missing an eye. Stella stayed making art, both types of art, into her 90s after Chevis died. And there's a enameled weight in the back that she made. She specialized a lot later in enamel. We were very, very lucky and blessed to be able to grow up surrounded by people like this who were just some of the most nice and decent people in the world. And with Ruth and Ben also especially tolerating me, who was, to say the least, relatively irresponsible for many years. Ruth and Dad loved the outdoors. Here's a picture of them, of Denis canoeing with his mother Flo in the middle of the canoe. Looks like it's on Little Tunk. I have no idea who the person at the canoe is. It might be his friend Roy Havey, but it doesn't really look like him. The bottom left picture is Denis and Roy Havey ice fishing. And they did that quite frequently, and they were great friends. Dwight lived in what used to be a big green house that is between this building and the dollar store, which recently has just been torn apart. They also enjoyed getting together, parties. Here's a picture of them at Bayhead, and they had a big author's party where you had to come dressed as some author. Denis is real love sailing. This looks like a picture of him on his AJ True 26-foot sloop that he kept in Serena Harbor. Spent a lot of time out on that. He was nice enough to allow me to use it one summer with my son Eric, when Eric was 6 or 7, and we would motor with it. And Eric would get it in the front. We took the hatch off, we put a big block of wood underneath there for him to stand on, and he would just stand looking out from the front of the boat, enjoying the ocean. And we would tow Denis behind us and find a nice place, we'd throw the anchor out, row in, have a snack, and then row back out, making sure he had a life jacket on. The shop continues to do well. Judy Mace comes in to work with the play in the shop. She made a lot of the pressed dishes that were sold very well. And Judy was a lifelong friend, Sheena, Ruth and Dan. On the right is a group of pottery that Uncle Dan had in the Worcester Museum Traveling Art Show. And it is more of a more modern style. And in fact, the vase on the right, the big one, we have. He also had some pieces in the Smithsonian's Traveling Show of American Craftsmen. My father retires, so the Vibert sisters, the Nell sisters, get to be back together, and they made the most of it. We moved in year-round to our house, which had been Lou's inn, Bayhead Inn, and became our year-round house that we lived in. It was couldn't ask for a nicer place, great place to get fun and everything like that. It heated like a barn, but it was okay. On the bottom right is a picture of Bayhead when it was being operated as an inn by Uncle Lou, with the awning on front. And it was like there's a couple badminton posts out on the side lawn. And we did the same thing. We played with the water badminton. Families got together for almost every holiday. This is a picture of the Viberts in the hills at a Thanksgiving meal in the sun porch that they had. And it's all of the Hills children, their wives, and my mother, father, Ruth and Dan, and 3 young men sitting at the bottom. There is my sister's oldest son, Chris, who unfortunately died of tragic, did not live the long ones. That was a wonderful young man. The middle one is my son, Eric, and it's hard for me to believe that he's now 55. And on the left is Suzanne's son, Jeremy. Mother starts working in the pottery shop in summers, helping out Ruth. They loved each other dearly, but they were really bitter occasionally. And this is a photo of them in the shop. And I don't know whether Ruth is telling my mother, this is how you do it, and my mother's ignoring her, or it's just the way we want the photo got taken. It could be either one. The pottery shop now changes a bit. Frank Stokes no longer works, he retires there. Denis Riley comes in, excellent, superb potter, to take Frank's place. Judy Mace is still there working, and there is Ruth and Dan. And then we talk about, and this is not my word, this is Ruth's, the shop girls. The shop girls were teenagers or older that came in to help Ruth in the shop and in the house. The first one was Marcy Gordon, who lived directly across the street. The second one was her. And then the final shop girl was Marty Trout, who was the daughter of their great friends, Gordon and Mark. And Marty's here somewhere in the audience, and she was just great. She stayed with them and helped. Just as sweet a person as you'd ever want. Ruth and Dan started going away for the winter. The first places they went away to was actually Mexico with their friends. Stellan Shows, and Lou Dietz and his wife Danny Winters. And we have a great small painting at home that shows Ruth and Dan and their dog Jeannie in Mexico on the beach, leading up to the little house that they stayed there that Danny Winters painted. Once they got to Florida, they went more big time. Most of the years they were in Florida, they leased this octagonal beach house, and it was really a good beach house. Friends came and visited. Judy and Wayne Mavis, visiting here on the deck there with Ruth and Ruth's and Dan's great little border collie, English. Gordon and Mark Trower came and visited, and again were some of the best friends Ruth had originally in Montreal, though Gordon and Mark moved down to Chevique Island in Castro Bay. Time has passed. Nobody is young anymore. It is now coming up for both of their 50th wedding anniversaries, a year apart. The one on the right is my mother and father at the same hotel in Charlottetown where they had their first date. They all went to Charlottetown PEI. My father was, one of the things he was most proud of was that he had jumped the border before America was involved and volunteered to fly in the RAF, and always on one of his blazers had his squadron badge, as he wears now. The next year, it was Ruth and Dan's turn. And so we, as a group, decided to celebrate their 50th wedding anniversary at Ellie's in my house on Taunton Bay. It's the land we had actually we bought from Ruth and Dad. And we lived there for 33 years. And great 50th wedding anniversary. Many of their friends were there. The Viberts have retired. They no longer are working. This is, I think, 2002. And Uncle Denis, unfortunately, I believe, passed away in 2004. So his retirement time was shorter. But they made the most of it. They were truly good. And I have to say, he was one of the most extraordinary people I have ever met in my life. The two Manel sisters get together with the other part of the Manel family on the second marriage. These are Heather, Bill, and Brenda Gall, who were their aunts, Esther's children. Paul Manel is there with his wife, and Paul is Uncle Lou's son. Then, of course, there's Suzanne and Chris, myself and Ellen, and the two glamour girls, the Manel girls. They love to have their picture taken. Time has passed again, and my mother has passed away. Denis is gone, and my father is gone. There's just Ruth. Ruth lived within a month of her 101st birthday. It came a point in time, approximately 3 years before she passed, that she could not live alone, and she needed new help. So what we did was we found this wonderful person who was the lady in the very front on the left-hand side, Marlene Walker, who had a house where she took in 3 older people. And was just, she called them her queens. She did many things. Ruth had a good time. And she was darned she was going to have a good time until she got there. In fact, she had managed to get herself kicked out of Seaport. I'm serious. So, and that's Ruth. Anybody know her or no? Marlene would take them from manicures, to swimming, took her to the racetrack so she could get bet on the horses, and then would take her out to what they called their camp, which was actually a big tag on trailer near on the pond in the Bucksport area. So took very good care. While Ruth was there, not too long before she passed, one of the Vibert girls with her husband, Marguerite, Craig, his last name was Craig. And they came and visited because they wanted to see Ruth. After their visit, which they visited when she was in Marlene's house, when Tom came out, Paul Craig. When Paul came out, he said, when I get old, I want to stay at Marlene's. It was a wonderful, wonderful place. And we were terrified when Ruth went in because she could be a little bit obstinate. And she loved it almost from the beginning. So that was great. And this is her 100th birthday at Chivers. And that's how the virus came to go. Ruth and Dan were amazing people. They treated us as if we were their children. And we certainly gave them the cause to pull arrow, but they never was brought up. And we were happy to do it. Vibert pottery now is very hot on the market. You can find it at antique stores, also on eBay, and if you're lucky, you'll find a piece at some yard sale. I have. And that is basically my story of Ruth and Vibert and Pine Tree.